never had a fair shot. All black, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we're joined today by Professor Quincy T. Mills, Professor of History at Vassar College and the author of the new book, Cutting Along the Color Line, Black Barbers and Barber Shops in America, just published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. How are you doing today, Professor Mills?
Very, very good, Professor Neal. I'm glad to be on the show.
Of your new book, your colleague Melissa Harris Perry says Cutting Along the Color Line is a singular achievement. It will have a permanent place on my syllabus. And Zarif, who is the barber for President Obama, says that Mills provides a fascinating insight into the history of African-American barbers. He brilliantly captures their culture, traditions, perseverance to succeed against tremendous odds. So talk a little bit, Professor Mills, about how you came to this book. What was your interest in these barbershops?
Certainly. I came to this book actually through Melissa Harris Perry's first book, Barbershops, Bibles, and BET. I did an ethnography of a barbershop on the south side of Chicago for her work. And in the process of sitting in that south side shop for 4 to 5 days a week, observing the conversations that these men and women were having, I couldn't help but think about how this space had evolved historically. We've talked a lot about barbershops being these spaces where black men go and they hang out and talk, and certainly that was the case in that particular barbershop. But I was curious, had this always been the case? And so I, of course, had to dig a little deeper to answer those kinds of questions. And I came across this barber, George Meyers. Now, George Meyers was a barber in Cleveland, Ohio. He was William McKinley's barber before he became president. And what excited me about Meyers was that he had 8 reels of microfilm papers. And for a historian, that's a godsend, first
Right.
of all.
Gave you an archive, yeah.
Exactly. But the idea that this barber had an archive was also fascinating. And one of the reasons that he had an archive was because, one, most of his patrons were wealthy white businessmen and politicians. And because of that, McKinley, for example, tapped Meyers, his barber, to organize black voters in Cleveland, in Ohio, and in many respects in the nation. And so once McKinley was elected, Meyers received a flood of letters from the North and the South asking Meyers to put in a good word with McKinley for patronage positions that they were seeking in their hometowns. And so that sort of opened up a window, for me at least, into Meyers as this political conduit through his barbershop. Now, Meyers never stopped cutting hair, but he was always intimately involved in Republican politics. And so that, through the story of Meyers, I knew that there was a larger story to tell about the history of black barbers and barbershops than we had thus far been discussing.
You know, it's interesting because I think anyone who spent any time in a black barbershop intuitively understands the cultural value of the space, the social value of the space. But I think it's also something that we take for granted. The language that you use to describe, black barbers is this kind of key component of the commercial black public sphere, right? Where we have the intersection of commerce, culture, masculinity, and politics. I mean, talk a little bit about the complexity of this space. I mean, the thing that is particularly interesting to me is this notion of commerce. And we're not just talking about the haircuts. I get my hair cut here in Durham. A guy by the name of Anthony Boone, the barbershop is called 360. When I go there, if I need to get some bean pies from the Nation of Islam, I can buy them in his barbershop, right? If I want a new mixtape, I can buy it from the barbershop. There's always the cat who's just liberated some ribeyes from the supermarket, right? Who comes through, who wants to be able to, to sell them in that kind of context.
Exactly.
I mean, talk about how these spaces develop, particularly through the antebellum period, to be this really critical space economically, culturally, politically, and again, a space of even intimacy for black men, historically.
Yeah, so we must begin with the service economy, essentially. And so first, I think, we have usually not talked about the barber when we've talked about the barbershop. We talk about the customers and how they interact, but we focus less attention on the barber. But let's be clear that the shop itself wouldn't exist if the barber wasn't there and if the barber wasn't making money, right? So I think we have to start with the politics of the service economy and the ways in which race and gender have historically been infused in that economy. And so we certainly know that during slavery, much of the service work was within the realm of African Americans, right? They were confined and restricted to this particular area of the economy, largely because, one, that's the work that slaves did, and white folks didn't want to do work that resembled the work that slaves did. And so barbering comes out of that larger tradition. Barbers began as personal servants to their masters, who certainly shaved them, took care of their coats, in some cases were their valets, and certainly through that, barbers or slaves, enslaved men, would use barbering to get off the plantation, right? So in downturning economies, masters would hire out their skilled slaves to earn some extra money, and barbers took advantage of this. And so barbers were often among the slaves who were hired out, and this gave them mobility. They were able to, in some cases, set up shop in the city, and with the earnings from their barbering work, they had to send a portion of it back to their master. And certainly this gave them the space away from the plantation, away from the surveillance of their masters, to build some income, but also space to escape in many ways, and many of them did. But these were barbers who were or enslaved men who hired out, who were working with free black barbers. So you have free blacks and slaves sort of working together. So free blacks are hiring enslaved men from white masters, right? And so this relationship between barbers as owners, but also as employees and as free men and as slaves, sort of develops during the antebellum period. But certainly after slavery, after emancipation, African Americans still sort of took advantage of the process of shaving white men, and so they maintained that practice. And so, in thinking about what they had to give up, sort of thinking about the ways in which race was infused in the service economy, so white men enjoyed being shaved by their black barbers because they loved their black servants in the same way that they loved, right, their black domestics. And when I say love, I don't mean the sort of intimacy love, but they really had to have their black servant in one way or another. And certainly, as we know about the lost cause in terms of losing the Civil War, the rise of Reconstruction, and the ways in which black men certainly had much more mobility, much more access to politics, had sort of holding on to their black servant, so to speak, their black barber, they loved that, essentially. And so black men took advantage of that, and they got rich doing it. And so barbers like John Merrick, right, from Durham, who was the Duke's barber, right, the tobacco magnates. And, he, again, got rich shaving them. And he went on to found the North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company, which still exists. Alonzo Herndon out of Atlanta, another sort of New South barber. Again, same thing. He used the profits from his barbering business to go on to found the Atlanta Life Insurance Company. And there are other barbers who were situated like Merrick and Herndon. But these folks, right, sort of, again, played on the politics of deference in their shop, the deference to the white patrons, in order to reap some kind of financial benefits. Now, let's be clear, they were not divorced from black communities because they were shaving white men. In many ways, black communities thought that these barbers, because they had access to these men of power, that these barbers would sort of use some of those resources, right, in support of black communities.
They could be brokers, right? They could be
Merrick
brokers, yeah.
Herndon did, right? So so first, I'd say we have to start with the service economy. But to your question, though, part of the framework here in thinking about the commercial public sphere, as I call barbershops, is to think about sort of these three categories of people: the barber, which includes the owner, and barbers who are not owners, right? The barber, the patron in the chair, but also this waiting public, right? The men and women who are sitting in the waiting chairs, waiting to get shaved or haircuts or just hanging around. One reason why you can buy a bean pie or a plant or a DVD or a watch in a barbershop is because these independent itinerant entrepreneurs, they know that there will be a body of waiting people in the barbershop to sell these products to, right? Yeah. And so I think that's, if we sort of think about, the economy of the shop, again, as you said, right, the economy of independent entrepreneurs coming in to sell their goods, but also the act of shaving men and the act of cutting their hair, but also women. I want to sort of put that in there too, is to say that I think everything that comes out of the shop, I think, has to start there. Yeah.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Quincy T. Mills, who is a professor of history at Vassar College and the author of the new book, Cutting Along the Color Line, Black Barbers and Barber Shops in America, just published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. You talk a little bit, and I thought this was a really fascinating story, about the role that black barbers played in terms of being part of a communications network, particularly around the Underground Railroad. There's all these fascinating stories, for instance, about the Pullman porters in the early 20th century and their ability, whether it be to take copies of the Chicago Defender down south, as part of a distribution network of information and products, et cetera. But you're suggesting that black barbers played a significant kind of role in that regard also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's two ways in which they serve that kind of role. One is certainly their actual shops, right? So there are some very wonderful and fascinating stories of fugitive slaves who are, escaping, running away, and they go from station to station, of course. And there's some wonderful stories about fugitives looking inside of barbershops to see if the shop was owned by, if there were black men in there, and actually going into shops to sort of sit there overnight, right? So certainly we know that black churches played that role largely, but I think we know less about the ways in which barbershops also played that role, right? Which is quite funny because these barbers, of course, spent their daytime shaving white men, and these white men didn't allow or would not allow African Americans to come in as customers.
Right.
And so we, on the one hand, we think that, well, these barbers, they were trading deference for dollars, right? They were capitulating to the wishes of their white customers. They were weak, they were conservative. I think that's far too simplistic. In many ways, we have to try to uncover, which is, of course, is hard to do, what happened after the lights turned off and the doors were locked. And thinking about the ways in which fugitives sort of could rely on barbershops in many cases to hide out is one way to sort of think about that. The other way, right, is to talk about the barber himself and slave masters who were, moving north to find their runaway slave. They often stopped at a hotel and a barbershop, and in some cases a restaurant. Well, we know that African Americans were the service workers, right, in all those places, right? And so they would say, I heard, Master so-and-so from Kentucky looking for such and such a slave. You better get word that he better get moving, right? And so these information networks would often happen in barbershops, but also, again, in hotels and in restaurants, because, again, blacks were working in those spaces.
You talk about the rise of the new Negro barber and how the process and importance of the black barber and the black barbershop changes, during the Great Migration period. You made a reference, for instance, in passing a few minutes ago about even women in the barbershop. I mean, we think about that as a more contemporary moment as we see black women, cutting all their hair off or getting high top fades and things like that. But you talk about the significance of the bob during the 1920s that necessitated women being in barbershops. Talk about this notion, as you do in the book, about how the barbershop becomes this space, for congregation, for community to be constituted, in a segregated world, post-emancipation, in which the clientele of these barbershops are no longer necessarily these white men who are looking to be groomed, but absolutely the barbers need black people as clientele for them to be able to survive economically.
That's right. So the larger story of the book essentially tries to connect this 19th century story of black barbers and white patrons and all the politics that were surrounded there, and this 20th century story of black barbers and black patrons, the story that we are most familiar with today. And one of the major, so there are tons of factors that went into this change over time, both internal and external. So you're getting at the internal factors, right? The ways in which African Americans decidedly made this sort of shift. And so beginning in the 1890s, a new generation of African Americans entered barbering. They were not as connected to whites as their predecessors were. And so they decidedly opened barbershops in black communities. And certainly this is, as you know, this is the same time that Jim Crow's on the rise. Jim Crow is being codified. African Americans are being restricted and confined to particular areas of cities. And so African American men opened barbershops in black communities to tailor to black consumers. And so, but it's not until the Great Migration that these shops become, again, these sort of hubs of activity. That's not to say that they were not hubs of activity in the South before the migration, because certainly they were. And in many cases, potential migrants sat in the barbershop and read the Chicago Defender and sort of thought about and talked about the move north, and in some cases collectively migrated north as a result of their collective interaction and conversation that happened in barbershops, in some cases beauty shops in the South. But we see barbershops sort of ballooning, right, as this space to engage each other during and after the migration. And in many ways, I think if we look at the migration and then look at the Great Depression, we see that these are two historical moments where African Americans particularly had to come together collectively, right? And so when someone moved north, one of the biggest questions that they had was, where do I go? Where do I live? Where do I eat? Where can I find a job? And so the Urban League certainly helped in that regard. But on a sort of a less formal basis, barbershops helped in that regard, because barbers, I mean, they were situated within the communities. They would see various constituencies of men, both middle class, working class, and unemployed, coming through their shops, and they can tell a new arrival of what church they might want to go to, or what area they might want to look for an apartment in, and also, but thinking about the Great Depression, again, a time where folks didn't have jobs, needed some help, and sometimes just needed a space just to decompress. And barbershops in many cases provided that space to decompress. And it provided that space where they could play the numbers, right? So they can sort of imagine a new day by the dream that they had, and they're going to play 556 because they had a dream about somebody, threw some paper at them, right? And so I think, again, barbershops provided this sort of space of community and congregation at times where things are hard, but also at times where things are good too. I like to talk about barbershops as the space of a willing congregation, because I think it gets us out of this sort of rot integration versus segregation model, but it also gets us out of the separation model. And so I don't talk about barbershops as sort of black nationalist spaces, right. But I also don't talk about them as spaces where black men went to because they couldn't go to white barbershops. No. And we know that this wasn't the case because after 64 and 65, with the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, where there's all this talk about, black businesses now catering to a larger market, one, right. and Black consumers having access to a larger market. Certainly, there were many African Americans who protested white barbershops for not cutting Black men's hair.
The classic example of the college students, right, going to these colleges in these all-white towns and trying to figure out where they're going to get a haircut from, right?
As many a Black college student, both male and female, have thought about. Who's going to cut my hair? Right? Who's going to style my hair, right? And in many cases, as we know, many Black men, Black college students knew how to cut hair, and so actually when I was a student, I got my hair cut in one of my friend's dorm rooms, right?
Yep.
Not that there wasn't a Black barbershop in town, there was, but it was a little far and I couldn't get to it, so it was a lot easier. But that was a question: who would cut my hair? And so yes, college students sort of raised that question as early as the 1950s. But what we see after these major civil rights acts is that Black men still went to Black barbershops, right? They weren't going there, right? Again, because they were denied access. Certainly, they didn't want to be told where they could or could not get a haircut, which is why they protested those white barbershops. But they didn't trust white barbers to cut their hair either. Right. Black men went to, and I argue still go to Black barbershops because of the production of Black culture that happens in this space, right? The performance and production of Black masculinity cannot happen in white barbershops. That has to happen in places like Black barbershops. And so Black men go to Black barbershops because they want to be around Black people. And there's nothing wrong with that. And there's something I think very empowering and endearing about that as well.
I mean, it raises a very interesting point, right? Because you go to any barbershop in Black America today, one of the things is that's most striking is how fully integrated those spaces are in terms of a range of folks in different Black economic and class situations, vocations. It's not unusual to be sitting there, again, here in dorm, where a dude who's trying to find a job is sitting there with the dean of the law school, from North Carolina Central. I mean, and that's kind of a reality of the place. How important is having this kind of range of Black perspectives in this space? How important was it, to think about, in terms of politicians, right? When Barack Obama first started running and there were all these questions about his authenticity, right? As a Black person, it wasn't unusual to see these posters of Barack Obama in a barbershop, getting his hair cut by a Black man, as a way to say, oh, okay, so this is a brother. But how important was it, again, for politicians to be able to know that this is where you could find a cross-section of Black America? But as you mentioned, the Black press, to be able to have access to this Black thought, if you will, that's congregated in these spaces.
Yeah, because I think there are very few spaces that where you get that sort of cross-section of, I'm going to say particularly men. Certainly, women have always been in the barbershop, certainly going as the daughters or the nieces of men. They've been there as customers. They've been there as barbers even. They have been there dealing with the nails of men, right? But I think certainly for the most part, a majority of people in the barbershop will certainly be men. So on the one hand, I think in terms of class level, that's probably the few spaces where you get this cross section. Because if you think about the street corner, right, or the bar, there's an element of respectability that I think won't be there for many people, although I don't really buy that. There's the church, right? But then there's questions of faith that I think, complicates that a bit. And so when you think about barbershops and beauty shops as well, one of the few spaces where you get this cross-section of people. And I think for many people, it's the closest to a democratic space as you can get. Yeah. And I say as closest to, because even then I think that's complicated. For one, again, as I said, it's mostly men. There are women in most barbershops, but still mostly men. I think because it's mostly men, it can't be truly democratic, right? Let's just be clear. But also, barbers as owners have a lot of say in whether or not that space will be democratic or not. And I think we have to account for that. In some ways, barbers will shut down a conversation in a heartbeat, And that's not democratic, right? And so it's complicated. Nonetheless, again, this is the closest that we get to. And so thinking about Barack Obama, and he actually had this barbershop and beauty shop campaign during his first run, where he sent volunteers into barbershops and beauty shops to organize voters. Again, largely because of the waiting public, but also because, again, you'll have the working class, the unemployed, right, the middle class, the upper class, again, moving about in the same space, and you can get, in many cases, a difference of opinion, different perspectives on various issues, and folks who aren't afraid to say things that they might normally be censored for in other spaces. And so I think as long as we can still foster that kind of discourse in shops, I think our investigations into the pulse of society will be all the better for it.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We've been talking with Professor Quincy T. Mills, Professor of History at Vassar College, the author of the new book, Cutting Along the Color Line, Black Barbers and Barber Shops in America, just published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. Let me ask you quickly about, the contemporary dynamic of barbershops. You mentioned, black male college students. You knew there was always somebody on campus that could cut your hair. And in some ways, we often joke, for instance, about Latino communities and their affinity for work around garden work and lawns and cultivating lawns and things of that nature. But we also know economically, for many folks, for many migrants, for many immigrants, this becomes an inroad to a regular job, a skill set, that they then can translate into their own businesses, right? And folks always need to have their lawn done, And I think about an earlier generation of African-American men who intuitively understood the value of learning how to cut hair, of having their own clippers. Have clippers will travel, if you will. So no matter what you desire to do professionally, to get your start, if you knew how to cut hair and you had your own clippers, you could at least feed yourself, right? Until you can do these kind of things. I talk to barbers all the time, and they don't see that same kind of desire for that kind of work for a young generation of black men, right, who aren't interested in picking up the clippers, and because they don't see it as work that's of value. I see the same thing as you probably do, also traveling around the country, and in these black men who continue to shine shoes. Yeah. And they will say all the time, whatever people might think about this as a vocation, this is my business, right? I set my own hours, right? When I decide I'm done, I pack up and I'm done. How do we get a younger generation of young men to understand the value of that as credible work, as a skill set that's of value for them to develop themselves? And so that's one piece of the question. But also, you mentioned things like the Black Barbershop Health Outreach Program. What are some of the innovative practices that are occurring now in terms of knowing that we have black men and there's this kind of desire for intimacy in this space, to be able to take advantage of having these black men congregate in these space in the contemporary moment?
Yeah. So the first question, and I think it's instructive to go back to the immediate post-emancipation moment when African Americans, gained their freedom, and they thought about work in different ways than white Southerners and white Northerners thought about work, right? So Southerners, white Northerners wanted black men and women to return to the field. And they wanted them to sign these work contracts. And so there were vagrancy laws where if, men were hanging out, then, there was something wrong with that because they had to be working. Because, of course, the South had been destroyed by the Civil War. But in looking at the voices of African Americans at the time, clearly they valued their leisure time. Yeah. They valued their leisure time long before this rise of a consumer society emerged in the 1880s and 1890s, right? I'm often reminded of Anna Julia Cooper's book, Voice from the South. There's a section in there where she talks about riding on the train and she's looking outside the window on the train, and she's thinking about all sorts of things. And one, she sees the chain gang, and she's thinking about these men and how they were likely duped into being incarcerated in the chain gang. She's thinking about her interaction with the conductor. Essentially, she's thinking. She's thinking about, and this is sort of what I call the intervals of labor. What she's arguing for in that book is that Black women need the time and the space to think, and that's critical, right? Away from labor. And what's interesting about barbering and barbershops is that in between customers, right, this interval of labor, barbers are thinking, they're talking, they're engaging, and what's underlying both those stories is that it would be helpful, I think, if young people understood the value of controlling your time. Certainly part of why I became a professor is because I control my time.
Absolutely.
If when I used to work at an insurance company, and I did not control my time, and controlling my time gives me this space to think and to organize myself in a way that I just couldn't if I were a regular wage worker. And so I think in many ways, young people tend to, not all of them, of course, right, but tend to think about the paycheck, which is certainly valuable, right? The paycheck is important because the paycheck pays the bills, it pays food, it pays for all the things, it pays for leisure time, pays for consumer goods, right? But nonetheless, I think, being able to control one's own time, which of course barbers have, they can control their time in the way that, so whether one is an owner or whether one doesn't own the shop but rents the booth, which is interesting about barbershops because barbers don't have to be owners to control their time, right? They pay their booth rent, in some cases give the owner a portion of their intake, but the barber actually, who is not the owner, has more control of the shop than the owner does. Because if this employed barber leaves, the customer's probably going to leave with them.
Absolutely.
Because customers, as we know, we are connected to our barber first, the shop second. And so again, barbers control their time, and you're absolutely right. There's a way in which, so we sort of talk about the side hustle, right? And I think young people talk about the side hustle. What's your side hustle? What are you doing outside of your regular gig, right? Whether you're a student, what do you do outside of being a student? Whether you're a professor, what do you do outside of being a professor? What do you do? What's the side hustle? And I think for in many cases, young people should, it would be helpful, right, to think about the side hustle. So, and I don't talk about that in this sort of illicit underground economy way, although for some people that's the case. But you think about Ice Cube, for example, who sort of began as this quote-unquote gangster rapper, and now he's making family movies. So there's a way in which we can think about him and his work, and again, how he has leveraged the skills that he has developed over the years. And I think that would be helpful for young people to think about. And your second question was?
Around things like the Black Barbershop Health Outreach Program, right? Innovative uses of the barbershop in the contemporary moment to be able to reach Black men.
Right, and so again, right, thinking about the idea that that barbershops and beauty shops are spaces where there will be people hanging around, ideally, right, this receptive audience that you can go to and tap and engage. And so if we sort of think about, again, how we can find a group of men to engage in all sorts of issues, whether that's issues around prostate cancer, whether that's issues around domestic violence, whether it's issues around masculinity and manhood and fatherhood. I would actually like to see, sort of, again, modeling on the Black Men's Health Initiative, I'd like to see, I think, Byron Hurt sort of take his message into barbershops and talk to men in barbershops and talk about domestic violence and talk about what it means to be a man in the 21st century. I think these spaces are ripe for all sorts of interventions. And so I would love to see all these things happen soon.
We've been joined today by Professor Quincy T. Mills, Professor of History at Vassar College up in upstate New York. He's the author of Cutting Along the Color Line, Black Barbers and Barber Shops in America, just published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. Thank you very much for joining us today, Professor Mills.
Thank you for having me, Professor Neal.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back.